Okay. Okay. Good evening. I'm John Hunter. I'm on the board of the Oregon Community Rights Network. Before we get going, there's a little announcement I have to make. I've been told to make is that for the Watersheds Initiative by Community Rights Lane County has been approved. Their signatures, all the signatures have been approved, and they have been giving a ballot number. So you now have officially that they have their work all cut out for them. So, and what they're doing really pertains to what we're talking about tonight too. So anyway, tonight we are continuing our webinar Wednesday series, Water is Us. Our guest for this episode is a friend of community rights, Chris Hall, who is a executive director of Water League, which is a 501c3 based in Southern Oregon. And they work to engage the public in the stewardship of water. His presentation this evening is entitled A Postmortem of the 2025 Oregon Legislative Session related to water-based bills. It'll last about 45 minutes and will be followed by a question and answer period. So now it is my great pleasure to introduce Chris Hall, who will have with all the details about insider deals, weak reform, and privileged stakeholders. In other words, he's talking about our present political system. Chris, go ahead.
Well, thank you. Thank you, John, and thank you everybody for having me here today. It's a real honor to be with you and to present on this topic. My name is Christopher Hall, and I'm the Executive Director of Water League. About a year ago, in fact, it was in October, I spoke before you, and it was a discussion about modernizing the conventional wisdom and discussing how the governor had called for modernizing the water code, the first type of big picture, big scale modernization that would have happened since over 70 years, 1955. And so I was skeptical about whether or not that was going to happen. And Water League produced a near 40-page paper, heavily researched on the topic. And I'm sorry to tell you tonight, but the I told you so has been borne out a year later, and I'm here to report on just a small portion of a very large topic. The title, as John mentioned, is a postmortem of the 2025 legislative session related to water bills, water-based bills. And it's around the urgent need to modernize the law and the way we make the law to protect water for future generations. Would like to note that all views and opinions expressed here are representative of Water League only. Water League engages the public in the stewardship of water. I always like to start with a nice picture. This is Little Grayback Creek in the Illinois Valley. And this is a September picture from a couple of years ago. These are what are called base flows, where groundwater discharges into streams and surface channels. And this water is cool. It's well shaded by a nice riparian area. And it's an ideal image we should all hope to see for our grandchildren. Water League acknowledges and honors all the indigenous peoples who made their homes since time immemorial throughout the areas where Water League works and upon whose ancestral homelands we live. Water League acknowledges the care by which indigenous inhabitants have stewarded precious natural resources for millennia and seeks to be of service within this historical framework. The 2025 legislative session. It revealed how Oregon's political process, driven by the conventional wisdom to empower privileged stakeholder syndicates, systematically excluded the broader public interest from shaping water policy, resulting in weak, ineffective laws that failed to address the state's growing water crisis.
Chris, are you changing slides? Because we're just seeing your front slide right now.
Okay, so let's see here. I am, and I guess it's not sharing across for some reason. Thank you for letting me know. I'm going to stop the
Yeah.
share and I'm going to try again.
Okay.
All right, we'll try this other version of it. All right. Can you see the slide?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay, great. Well, we'll try this version. Thank you so much for letting me know.
Yeah.
So this was the first slide. This was the second slide.
There we go.
This is the third slide, which is Little Grayback Creek that I was mentioning.
Yeah.
This was our land acknowledgement. And this was the introduction to the critique of the 2025 legislative session. And I'll start here again. The 2025 legislative session revealed how Oregon's political process, driven by the conventional wisdom to empower privileged stakeholder syndicates, systematically excluded the broader public interest from shaping water policy, resulting in weak, ineffective laws that failed to address the state's growing water crisis. First, let's break down a few terms, and there are going to be three terms that I explain in detail. The first will be privileged stakeholder syndicate. A privileged stakeholder syndicate, which is a term that I coined during the Senate Bill 1153 fiasco, is an informal but powerful consortium of established special interest groups who, due to their long-standing relationships and influence, are granted exclusive access and decision-making power in drafting and revising legislation. They are often very well informed on the issues, but still they are the usual suspects. The primary goal is to protect and advance their own specific interests, too often at the expense of the greater public good and environmental sustainability. Privileged stakeholder syndicate members are a diverse group sparring over the bills. As such, they act like political proxies for the partisan politicians we otherwise elect to legislate on our behalf. Privileged stakeholder syndicates have a few clubhouses, namely the legislative committees that are immune from deadlines where bills go into limbo for months. It's there where the syndicates operate on bills until the last minute when they finally appear before the public near the end of the legislative session. In these committees, privileged stakeholders force action or no action on certain bills, or they compromise to serve their collective or disparate interests. Importantly, members of the public are shunned from knowing which bills are lost in the jail holding cells and which will be let out for a floor vote to live for another day. I have a couple pictures here, they're graphs. You may have seen them before. This is from the business case for investing in water, published just a couple of years ago in 2023. On the left side, we see where water comes in from water sources, and on the right, we see where it goes out and what the primary water uses are. Surface water comprises 78% of all the water use, and groundwater contributes 22%. On the right, going out, you'll notice that irrigation, and we're talking big industrial irrigation with water rights, accounts for 78% of all water diversions. And then if we look at the domestic self-supply, that's 225,000 wells that represent just 1% of all the use. Those are domestic exempt use wells. You'll see public supply, which is 9%, and that is all the public supplies that do all the cities and account for 80% of the population of 4.2 million Oregonians. That includes all the industrial and commercial uses, the data centers, the breweries, you name it. Here's another one. This graph is just groundwater, and the blue represents the number of wells, and the red represents the amount of use. So under the left-hand column, domestic wells, well, they account for 88% of all the wells in the state, but they only use 4% of the water. Whereas irrigation wells account for only 7% of the number of wells, but they use 82% of all the groundwater. And then the next one over is community, which are public water supplies. They account for 1% of the wells and 10% of the groundwater. These are important ratios to keep in mind as we go forward. Now, we're going to move on to the next definition, the conventional wisdom. The conventional wisdom refers to the entrenched political culture that substitutes expedient beliefs for critical thought in Oregon's water governance. We use the term to describe how officials cling to regressive ideas, not because they reflect reality or serve the public interest, but because they are safe and convenient. The conventional wisdom manifests as decades of bipartisan inertia, a consensus protecting large-scale irrigators and elevating special interests over the broader public interest. Officials drained aquifers and dewatered streams by suspending their fiduciary duty to hold water in trust in favor of securing political bargains that maintain the status quo for specialized interests. When I say officials drain the aquifers, I am talking about legislators and others who made decisions that have had those effects. The conventional wisdom clings to a regressive 19th century and 20th century worldview that empowers privileged stakeholder syndicates to rewrite legislation behind closed doors, leaving 4.2 million Oregonians and future generations excluded from meaningful participation. This is the central theme of the discussion today. The third definition is the public interest. The public interest is neither the addition of all the special interests in a room, nor a thematic reduction of them to a few generic concepts. Rather, the public interest is a wholly separate phenomenon, which is what the entire society needs in order to remain civilized. Not surprisingly, serving the greater public interest usually requires some degree of limiting individual special interests. The public interest is what's in an interest to society as a whole, which sometimes is going to be different from individual special interests. The public interest is holistic, special interests are atomistic. To hold water in trust, state officials must consider the greater public interest as a distinct factor unto itself that focuses on the public health, safety, and welfare of the present and future, and upon the ecosystems upon which all life depends. The big question to answer later during the Q&A section is, well, if the conventional wisdom isn't working, then what is the alternative solution? The central problem, putting special interests into the position of shaping legislation, does not sufficiently serve or reach the greater public interest. Too often, a syndicate of privileged interests will solve their problems, but that does not necessarily result in what the public needs. This practice undermines democratic governance, effectively creating a two-tiered class system of public access to the government. The problem worsens when the tiny privileged sect of organizations privately plan legislative actions with elected officials to craft laws that serve their interests in using water that belongs to the public. And I'll recall those graphs I shared with you where the vast majority of water is used by irrigation. And I'll note that there are about 1% Oregonians hold those water rights. The statute 537.110, titled Public Ownership of Waters, states, all water within the state from all sources of water supply belongs to the public. The special interests are writing and bending laws that take a public resource and effectively privatize it. These are some results that you'll see. This is a beautiful creek, Deer Creek, which is a major tributary to the Illinois River that is dry as a bone a few years ago. This creek will have low spots, never like this. They have turned this creek, Deer Creek, into a gravel road. This is a section of the Harney Basin, which is currently under a rulemaking process to designate a critical groundwater area, and it looks more like a work of abstract art. This is a landscape that has been severely impaired. Gross inequity arises when these actors point to public testimony as a form of political cover for their subterfuge. Their testimony washing is duplicitous to the extent the public testimony is merely performative and made irrelevant to the outcome. Too often, people submitting their public comments and testimony feel as if they are tossing a pebble down a deep well. With rare exceptions, legislators and their privileged stakeholder syndicates will advance as they wish whether or not public testimony contains views that align with their preferred outcomes. Public testimony is too often coincidental. So, what happens when the special interests engineer outcomes through negotiations that result in compromises that they can live with, but run afoul of the greater public interest or even harm the public? Well, when stakeholders negotiate legislative outcomes that result in controlling the exclusive use of publicly owned water resources to benefit that privileged stakeholder class, does the disregard for public testimony result in unreasonably granting privileges or immunities that are not equally available to all? And yes, some of you may note that this is an equal protection question related to the Constitution. Picture this example. A bill addresses large-scale water use that only 1.5% of the citizenry may participate in, since water rights are an extremely scarce resource. And the privileged stakeholder syndicate comprises a sampling of those water users and an equal number of industry opponents. When the partisan proxies arrive at a negotiated compromise on the use of the publicly owned water, the public is often alienated from the decision as to how their water will be used. If the public cares for posterity, because our descendants are not here to speak up for themselves, then present and future rights to water are abridged. I return to this picture to remind us again the extent of the disparity in use. To keep this in mind, letting water users control the laws that regulate them has been disastrous, leading to the gross overappropriation of surface waters and groundwater. The extra legislative process running in the background has granted privileges and immunities to a very small class of water users. When this privileged sect of extra legislative proxies prevail on their interests, too often the rest of the public loses. Yes, you will note this is the same problem in all politics, but there's a difference because all the water belongs to the public. As noted earlier, the public has little to no hand in the outcome because too much of its testimony has been merely performative and used by legislators and their selected proxies as political cover for their extra legislative sessions held outside of the public view. I refer to this with the asterisk as testimony washing, and the testimony washing machinations are used to provide political cover for the work they do within these committees outside of the public view. An issue glowing around the edges of the Oregon Constitution like a penumbra arises when the public's interest in its water has been abridged by a tiny minority who has privileged access to the vast majority of water diversions, and those water users write or negotiate the laws that regulate their own water use. And the penumbra is, I'm not explicitly stating an equal protection concern, but the implication is there by the broader context and the principles of law. Oregon must do a better job upholding its duty under the public trust doctrine, which requires the state to manage water resources, not just for the short-term extractive interests in economic productivity, but for the health, safety, and welfare and ecosystems of the present and future. Now, here are some process failures of some key water bills. These are exemplary. There are many other examples. These are what we're going to see tonight. And I'm going to list them. There's Senate Bill 1153, which is what I call the Goldilocks bill, submitted by the governor, a fabulous bill that got ruined in committee. And there were two other bills. So if this is the Goldilocks bill, there was the too hot and too cold. Senate Bill 427 was too hot. House Bill 3501 was too cold, and they were addressing water right transfers. Senate Bill 1154, the Groundwater Quality Management Bill, which did pass, is the governor's effort to address and manage groundwater quality management areas. And that also got to essentially so watered down, most of the people who supported it bailed. And that was also done in one of those committees. House Bill 3419, which is near and dear to Water League's heart, is the Farm Worker Housing Bill. And I'll share with you how that exemplifies much of the problems. There was also House Bill 3194, which was the water use metering bill. And then there's House Bill 3800 and 3801, which were being merged in committee and were intended to supersede the Division 512 rules designating a critical groundwater area in the Harney Basin. And lastly, Senate Joint Resolution number 28, the Environmental Rights Amendment. For starters, I want to know that there is a difference between legitimate public debates about whether any given number of bills are worthy of becoming laws, leading to some bills passing and others dying, and taking bills into a clubhouse to be hashed out for 2 months before presenting them to the public a couple weeks before the end of the session, which is what happened with way too many bills. And I'll note that's why the big transportation package died. Now, Senate Bill 1153, it's a water right transfer reform bill. So are Senate Bill 427 and 3501. Senate Bill 1153 requires ecological protections and tribal reviews. So for instance, if you want to do a water right transfer, it still is, but the limits are you can't injure another water user. So if you move your water right across town or across the basin, you cannot injure another water right user, regardless of their seniority. And you may also not expand the size of the water right. Those are the two limits. And Senate Bill 1153 sought to include a third limit, which would say, well, you can't hurt aquatic species and some other ecological protections. And that would have limited what you could do in a water right transfer. Now, Senate Bill 427, I'm going to skip ahead, restricts transfers that would diminish stream flows. It's very simple. It simply said there's going to be a third, a third new restriction to the existing two, and it can't diminish a stream flow. And then the middle one was from the far right, House Bill 3501, and it basically prevented the Water Resources Department from taking the public interest into consideration when a water right transfer would occur. So for instance, somebody wants to do a water right transfer and the law prohibits Water Resources Department staff from considering the public interest standard during the water right transfer. It's extraordinary. And what happened with Senate Bill 1153 and these other two bills is they all went into the committee rules. Two of them went into the Senate Committee on Rules and one went into the House Committee on Rules, and they stayed there for a couple months. It was slowly coming out that the only thing that was going to happen was Senate Bill 1153 would advance, and the other two were there just to provide opposing polarized goals, as it were, to anchor the middle way, which was Senate Bill 1153. And 2 months went by, and the only people who knew what was going on were the people who were invited into the rooms to make changes. And when it finally came out, it was just a couple weeks before the end of the session, which after about 5.5 months is really just obscene. And there were several amendments that just came one after another. Nobody could keep up with them. And the critiques on both sides of the aisle, especially among the members of the public who were sending in their futile public testimony, was that this was just too much change at the last minute. And the watered down Senate Bill 1153 to an extent that really just made it worthless. Many of its supporters bailed, and we didn't even deign, Waterleak did not deign to critique the bill. We critiqued the process because it was so appalling. And Senate Bill 1153 for 2 months was just hatcheted up into pieces, and it was a real bummer because the governor's original bill was excellent. It was the middle way. It was not extreme in any direction, and it was a reasonable bill that got harmed in the process. Senate Bill 1154 is the governor's other bill, and it was dealing with groundwater. The original bill sought to link groundwater contamination directly to state control over water rights, land use, agriculture, and pollution permitting, meaning that there were a number of things you couldn't do in an area that was a groundwater management area designation, and that was preventing a bad situation from becoming worse. And well, it got watered down substantially during about a 2-month process behind and outside of the public view. It had enforceable state oversight, which became voluntary and advisory, which is basically nothing. Mandatory agency actions became outreach plans. It removed Water Resources Department's authority to deny water right approvals based on impaired water quality, meaning, no, we're not going to give you a water right to pump poison. Strict CAFO and ag nutrient restrictions became voluntary stewardship language, which is meaningless. And county prohibition on development in contaminated areas became permitting water and sewage service extensions, meaning that if you want to extend services for water and sewage, you could. And the original version of the bill was going to say, no, we're not going to allow you to encroach into an area where there's poison. And so the same thing happened with this bill for a couple months. It sat in committee. There were what are called stakeholders who were privileged to sit in that committee and hash out results. And by the time this thing made it, it was just a few weeks before the end of the session. Surprisingly, it did pass. The other bill did not pass. And it passed with a substantial, it was kneecapped. And the public, so many members of the public were outraged. House Bill 3419. So this is the water metering bill. Everyone in Salem knows metering domestic wells is political suicide. As we saw in those graphs I shared, there are 225,000 such wells, which account for only 1% of statewide diversions compared to irrigation, which we recall uses 78%. That's 78 times. Including households into the bill predictably signaled public outrage and killed the bill's real aim, which was metering the large-scale water users in problem basins. Adding exempt uses to the bill was a privileged stakeholder syndicate poison pill. And I have a little asterisk here. Water League has been, and myself, I am solely responsible, sat in an early meeting and provided written comments, and I missed the poison pill, which I am totally ashamed. And this episode led to our coining of the term privileged stakeholder syndicates and critiquing the subterfuge. And this is one of the really low points of the legislative session, was a good bill that would have metered big water rights. So we have a good idea of how water use is occurring in the state of Oregon, especially like 78% of it or more. And it got killed because of a poison pill. This is the kind of machinations and schemes that are going on that are unjustified and harm the public interest. Very similar numbers, House Bill 3194. This was the farm worker bill. This was a great bill. Water League supplied testimony to it. It helps specifically farm workers that are on organized crime syndicate cannabis grows, where they're living in forests, they're living under tarps, they're living in greenhouses, and they're terribly unsanitized conditions. And I documented 4 years ago the extent to which they were treated like narco slaves. Well, after 3194 was sequestered in the House Rules Committee, it's a good example of the proxy status of special interests. So for instance, there were special interests who were very concerned about the farm workers, and then there are the special interests like the Farm Bureau, who saw this as an encroachment on landowners and their membership. And so I'm quoting here from one of the privileged stakeholders and their discussions with elected officials. In fact, what was going on is that the stakeholders were updating the legislative officials on how they rewrote the bill for them. Quote, proponents have worked to respond to the opposition's concerns on the bill. I will briefly outline the changes from the base bill that make up the -6 amendment, which resulted from a half dozen or more meetings with the opposition. Another quote, at Oregon Farm Bureau's request, we added a rebuttable presumption for landowners. Also at the Farm Bureau's request, we greatly reduced the potential penalties under this bill. Now, I will point out that this was directed delivery in oral testimony to the committee of legislators, letting the legislators know how this bill was shaping up. Note, however, that it's the job of the legislators to legislate and to write these bills and to get them through, and then to solicit advice and commentary and input from the public. But in this situation, the legislators basically handed the bill over to like special interests to go sort out their problems and get back to us with a resolution. And what Water League found was that when this thing finally popped out of committee, we had an opportunity to write another set of testimony, which I did, and I responded to an amendment that was there in the Oregon Legislative Information System, OLIS, and I got it in hours before the public hearing. And then it turns out that they put another amendment in after that. So when the public hearing occurred, there was a whole nother amendment. It would completely change the bill. I had no idea this was going on. And what happened is that my public testimony that I submitted and worked hard on was like moot. And it actually was like a joke. It was like worthless because they had so completely manipulated and changed the bill that anything I wrote was just worthless. And so I had an upfront taste of what it was like to be just, contributing nothing at all and not being able to actually contribute because of the way the system was set up. House Bill 3800 and 3801, well, these bills would have superseded the administrative rules for a subset of water users in a critically overdrawn Harney Basin. You may know that the Harney Basin has excessively declining groundwater levels, some of the worst in the state, the Oregon Water Resources Department has been running a rulemaking process to designate a critical groundwater area. And with that designation comes a potentially possible subsequent action of a contested case that will curtail water uses. They are recommending curtailing up to 35% of all the water use in the basin. That is 95% of which is to irrigate alfalfa in the high desert because of the huge disparity between the annual recharge and the annual discharge of water in that basin. And one of the irrigators is a very powerful legislator who introduced these two bills to control the process and supersede the Division 512 rulemaking efforts that have been going on for 2.5 years. And then over 2 months, these bills sat in the House Rules Committee, and officials and their lobbyists worked to merge these two bills in the House Rules Committee on behalf of special interest irrigators who wished to avoid the regulatory hand of administrative law. Now, fortunately, they failed. But the point is that for 2 months leading up to this, to when these bills may have popped out of committee, the rulemaking process was under a cloud and a shroud of fear. And I mean, obviously not the irrigators. The irrigators on that rack were very much excited about the possibility of this, of these bills coming out, but it really put a cloud on the administrative rulemaking process, and it was just a sight to behold. And then lastly, Senate Joint Resolution 28, which is the Oregon Constitutional Environmental Rights Amendment. Elected officials traded away their constituents' rational interests in an environmental rights amendment in favor of the interests of privileged stakeholders whose unelected syndicate threatened legislators on a number of other legislative fronts over a ballot that would be, in their view, futile. They basically were saying, look, we're going to make your life miserable if you don't just bury this bill. It's just not worth it. It's not worth, this is not the battle you want to pick, is what they basically told them. And so there was a single public hearing. It was one of the biggest public hearings of the session, if not in recent memory. The public was vastly in support of it, but the special interests threatened the legislators, and it never left committee. And all of this bill was going to do was refer ballot language to the voters at the next general election. It wasn't actually going to amend the Constitution because you need the voters to do that. This was simply going to make a ballot referral, and they backed away from it, even though there were 12, 15, 20 sponsors of the bill. In fact, the chief sponsor, Senator Golden, noted, quote, Wednesday's Senate Rules hearing on Senate Joint Resolution 28 was the most crowded and energized that I've seen this session. I'll remember the Senate Joint Resolution 28 hearing for a long time. It so clearly reflects this historical moment in human thinking that the next time capsule buried in Oregon should probably include it. Then the Oregon Capitol Chronicle wrote and reported, quote, so many Oregonians supported a constitutional amendment to guarantee the right to a healthy and safe climate that the legislator had to open a second hearing room just to accommodate all of the people who came to speak in support of it at its only legislative hearing this spring. And then sadly, the Oregon Capitol Chronicle continued, and it quoted Senator Golden's views. Quote, Senate leaders let the measure die in part, he said, because there were real concerns that this coalition would be completely outgunned by industry and folks who don't want an environmental rights amendment in the Constitution, end quote. So Senator Golden was basically saying, oh, we're going to save you from yourselves by actually just burning this thing. These privileged stakeholder syndicate machinations grinding up Senate Joint Resolution 28 are the quintessence of special interest capture of the public trust. The political maneuvering that killed SJR 28 and recently obstructed the effort to fix corrupted ballot titles epitomize how the conventional wisdom operates to preserve entrenched interests at the expense of the public interest. Last year, near this time, I made a presentation to you, and I noted, and this is a slide from that presentation, 2025 legislative session, most significant water reform in 70 years. And I said, we must ensure changes that benefit the entire public, flora and fauna in the present and the future. Well, I'm here to report, I don't really think that that happened. In fact, this was hardly a 70-year scale overhaul, modernization of the water code. In my view, Governor Kotek had a beautiful image, and she made it very clear as to what that image was. It was made out of many different puzzle pieces that would come together to paint this picture. And essentially what the legislature did was they reached over to her box of puzzle pieces, threw them onto the table. Some fell off the table, some were facing up or some were facing down, and they called it good. And only a few that were facing up ever made it past final votes to get signed into law. And they were disconnected. They were not part of a bigger picture. And it was an example of how the conventional wisdom really just ruined the process, in my view. We are here at the question and answer session. And the question I had mentioned earlier was, well, if the conventional wisdom isn't working, then what's the alternative solution? And I'll leave you with one hopeful image that we can think of. House Bill 3372. This bill ended 70 years of prohibition. Oregon had unreasonably banned the public from using their exempt use domestic wells on their half-acre gardens, when those water users would have sold their produce at their local farmers markets. This bill was fully debated in public. All research, critiques, and commentary were out in the open. HB 3372 is widely regarded as in the public interest. And I believe this bill is an example of how other bills should function, where there is a full and public debate out in the open without any machinations going on in the back rooms about the merits of it, and then a full hearing and a decision based on the facts. I shall stop screen sharing now and have a nice chat.
Well, you sure do make a good argument for community rights. And there's a reason why many of us don't engage with the legislature and we just talk to one another, the citizens. We're so sick of it. I'm not any more encouraged about the legislature now than I was before your talk. And I mean, I applaud your efforts to try to interrupt what's going on there, but are you feeling like this is still going to be your MO, is to try to get your electeds to listen to you?
That's a good question, because community rights activists, and I think of CELDEF, they have a very dim view of the state and the state apparatus and the process by which the laws of the state are written and how they impact local communities. And there's no question that community rights organizations have very well articulated this problem better than I can. The thought that I have is that if this is still going on, somebody needs to get in there and do their best to steer it in the right direction, knowing that there are other ways that may be more productive and longer lasting to solve some of the worst endemic problems we have in society. But as long as these machinations are going on, as long as this activity is going on, I feel strongly driven to do what I can to bend the direction in a way that is more towards the public interest, that drives elected officials and appointed officials to act more in a way that upholds water holding water in trust and adhering to the public trust doctrine and the rights of nature and other doctrines that are largely in the public interest. And when I say the public interest, I'm talking about the public in the present and the public in the future, and all creatures and relatives, the rivers, the streams, the mountains, the flora, the fauna. One thing I'll point out is that the public of the present lives as if they're the only ones. And when I say that, I'm saying like a majority of the, not everybody, clearly not most people here, but the public typically lives as if the present is all that matters. And they don't really give enough consideration to the future, which we know will be here, or we hope will be here. They are the ultimate silent majority. They don't have a voice, and somebody needs to speak up for them. And so I am committed, if not to fixing huge problems, to minimizing the harm that is done. And but I hear you loud and clear about what might just be a futile effort, and it won't be for lack of trying, that's for sure. And I am so in support of the community rights efforts across the country. Hi, David.
Yeah, I have a question. Have you been able to connect with people from other groups that have experienced this same kind of legislative manipulations and cutting out the public? They're working on different issues other than water, because I think a lot of groups working on different issues experience the same kind of legislative roadblocks. And have you talked with anybody from other groups that recognize the same problem and want to take it on?
Yes, and the first thing I'll acknowledge is that the issues that I was discussing in this presentation are across all political spectrums, all states, all counties, federal government. And what I am actually sharing with you, as you I'm sure noticed right off the bat, is that in many ways, this is nothing new. And what I actually was hoping to share and get across tonight was my utter shock of what it's like when being right up close to it. For instance, I have experienced throughout my adult life reading in the newspapers and hearing about it in history class and learning about corrupt political situations. And it's always just sort of distanced. And yet this situation in the last couple of years, I have been right up against it. And it's a huge difference to to hear about it, read about it, learn about it, whatever, but then to be in it. It's like, well, there's the sausage factory. I read about it, but now I'm in it. And what I was hoping to share tonight was, if nothing else, the shock and awe of really what it's like when you get that up close. Now, other groups, well, there is an interesting group. It's called Oregon Water Unity, and it's a Facebook group. They got like well over 6,000 members, and it was started by a well driller back at the beginning of the legislative session, when it turned out that they discovered that the water metering bill included exempt domestic uses, and it just blew up. I mean, they got 6,000 members on this Facebook group in just a matter of weeks. It was extraordinary. And to a T, I would say the majority of the members are, I have this water's mine, I have a well, you can't come on my property, and you can't tell me what to do. And I actually, that is where I learned very quickly, mind you, that I had missed that they had put the exempt use water uses into that bill, the 225,000 domestic wells. And I was utterly ashamed. I was just like appalled. I was like, malpractice on my part. And what I found is that while I am politically at the opposite end of the spectrum of 6,000 members of Oregon Water Unity, it kind of rhymes with timber unity, we have a lot in common. And I think that when we get past the wedge issues, and when we get past the wedge issues, really, we have a lot in common, and I have a lot of respect for the folks who have really very valid concerns. And I will tell you that most of the people on that group are outraged for the same reasons that I am. They are frustrated and angry at the neoliberal machinations. I use that word because it's so effective of what is actually going on in the legislature. And so I am always looking for ways to connect with people, especially people who have a different take on the way the world is than me. And it's a real blessing. And so it's a real honor and a blessing to share so much and have so much in common with them, even though if I'm coming at the car crash looking at it from this direction and they're coming at the car crash looking at it from this direction, we both see the car crash. And what we do is we come running to help no matter from what direction we see it from. And that's something that I think we share. And so what I will say is that environmental organizations that, you know, lean to the left, that have been around for a while, they do not agree with my assessments. They are in it. And they have a very plumb position. And they're not going to rock the boat. And they're, you know, it's just, I mean, you might not get your emails responded to. They may not invite you to the next privileged stakeholder syndicate meeting. So like there's a decades of that. And you know, I mean, water leagues, our logo is a trident. And our brand is that we cannot be bought. And we cannot be, tell us that you're not going to reply to our emails. We don't care, right? So our independence and our courage of our convictions is our brand. And I stand with people regardless of, not totally regardless, but in general, without regard to their specific viewpoints, I stand with people who hold those principles.
That's great. We appreciate your work. We're here for a couple more minutes. Anybody have a last question? Comments? John, you're muted.
Yeah, I just want to say, Chris and his group, I think they deserve some credit for that one piece of legislation that did pass for the that would have limited, you know, that made it difficult for the people that have half-acre farms. I know he was pushing that last fall when he did his presentation. So anyway, I want to congratulate him for at least getting for at least getting that accomplished. So, and I was just wondering about metering all the individual wells. Like I'm in a situation where we have a well, but for maybe 6 months of the year we had to get water delivered. How would they monitor something like that?
You know, you can file a dry well report with the Water Resources Department, and that helps them understand much better where groundwater declines are occurring. Having water in your well is a human right. And when your well goes dry and you have to buy water, it can be expensive and it's an injustice. And so I've looked into that program. It is a good program. It's just, you just report your dry well. You tell them for how long it's been dry. And the more information they have about this, the more the Water Resources Department can go out there and try to address these excessively declining groundwater levels. And what I'm going to say in the last minute that I have here is that I originally, about 4 years ago, was kind of skeptical about the Water Resources Department because I watched them just ignore how organized crime syndicates from Eastern Europe sacked Southern Oregon and destroyed our communities and ravaged our watersheds and dewatered our streams and groundwaters. And since that time, I've come to really get to know the staff who work at the Water Resource Department, and they are all very concerned about the health and the welfare of the ecosystem and the water resources, not just for the users today, but for the long-term future. And so I have an enormous amount of respect for the work they're doing. They are told to work, keep their heads down. You know, you don't get political, they don't share opinions, they just try to show up every day and do a good job. And I just think that they should be celebrated. I really think they're doing a good job. And they're working under enormous stress because for decades, their organization was like a clientele-based organization. Their clientele was like 1% of Oregonians who held water rights. And their job was just to manage those water rights. But all the water belongs to the public of Oregon. And in fact, they were always supposed to manage water on behalf of the 99% of Oregonians who don't hold water rights and are 4.2 million Oregonians, and manage those water rights for the public interest. And it's only been in the last number of years where the tide has changed. And I can tell you, the Water Resource Department, under the direction of the governor and probably the previous governor, are working to turn the ship and really manage water on behalf of all of Oregons and the greater public interest of the present and the future, to ensure that our great-grandchildren have an ecosystem to go out into and fresh water to drink and play in, and for the flora and the fauna as well. And so it's not so much, even though it's still going on, it's evolving. The paradigm is shifting away from being just a strictly clientele-based organization for 1% of Oregonians who just use almost all the water.
Really great presentation, Chris. Such a comprehensive view. I appreciate it so much.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate being here. It's a pleasure. And thank you. Thank you very much.
Yes.
You're always welcome. You're always welcome to reach out to me by email. My email is chris@waterleak.org. My phone number is public 541-415-8010. Please, open door policy. Thanks.
Thank you. And thank you everybody for showing up and being present. We really appreciate that.